Hi everyone, this is going to be my video on how to build the right strategy for acquiring pitch accent in Japanese. I'm hoping this is going to be applicable to pretty much all ranges of learners, whether you're earlier on or advanced in learning Japanese. I think I've seen, people at all levels struggle with acquiring pitch, so hopefully this will be useful for more or less everyone. A little bit about myself. I've been learning Japanese for 13 years. I semi-professionally interpret it, and I care a lot about pronunciation and pitch and, sounding native-like. And I've helped people primarily on Discord reach very high levels of pitch accent and pronunciation. I've seen a lot of people where they struggle and have some thoughts on the right strategy to use overall. There's certainly other resources available for pitch accent, many in English. Many people may be aware of Dogen's pitch accent course. The difference between this video and those resources is going to be that this is more about strategy. It's not going to so much get into any details, except to maybe serve as an example in some places. The first thing I want to talk about briefly is just the value of pitch. Why does it matter? There's people generally in two camps. One is the camp that pitch accent doesn't matter at all. Japanese people speak with different pitch anyways. Who cares? Other camp is, oh God, you need to speak with perfect pitch, otherwise you won't be able to make friends. These are both obviously just incorrect. The truth is that what matters most is being able to actually speak Japanese, so that's more important than your pronunciation. And then, at some point, once you become intermediate or advanced, then some cases your pronunciation is going to be more important than other factors, like using the perfect word or turn of phrase. If your pronunciation is making you unintelligible or it's grating on the ears or sometimes you're saying one word instead of another word that you intended, those things are going to end up sticking out the most compared to other minor details that you might be working on. And at that point, once you're at the advanced stage, it can actually sometimes be difficult to go back and fix your pronunciation, especially for pitch, because you've built a bunch of bad habits, but in the case of pitch in particular, pitch accent, you basically need to learn it per word. And if you've learned tens of thousands of words without acquiring the right pitch for each word, then if you try to fix it late in your journey, that means you need to, for each word, learn the right pitch. And it can be very daunting. It's certainly not impossible to do that. I, in fact, myself fixed my pitch accent pretty late on, and there's other examples of people doing that, so I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's definitely requires a lot of effort to do it that way. And it seems more reasonable to, if possible, use a strategy where you put in a limited amount of effort at the beginning, and then simply while you're acquiring new vocabulary in the language as you learn it, you then simply acquire the pitch with the word as you learn it. That is the ideal thing to do. That's how Japanese kids do it. You never hear a kid with incorrect pitch accent on the handful of words that they know. They say it correctly. So I think in that sense, that is the most optimal strategy, and that's what I'm going to be trying to outline here. Okay, so the first thing to do is that you need to improve your perception. This means that when you hear Japanese, you need to be able to actually pick out the pitch. And it's not like people are tone deaf most of the time, so people hear the pitches. It's just that they interpret it as something else. They interpret it as emotion or as sentence level intonation or something, and it doesn't get interpreted as pitch. Or to be more specific, it doesn't get interpreted as something that's part of the word. So that's what a pitch accent is. It's the usage of pitch to somehow define or be part of the word, similar to how stress accent works in English to differentiate words. So advanced learners do usually acquire pitch to some degree, but it tends to be like a sort of weak acquisition of it. So for example, an advanced learner will say a sentence, most of the words get said with the right pitch, but then they might say the same word in another sentence and they get the pitch wrong that time, because it's sort of just like vaguely they have a sense for things, but the pitch doesn't really become part of the word. And because of that, for example, if an advanced learner who hasn't studied pitch like gets really excited or really angry or starts putting emotion into their sentence, that can often override the pitch, which actually isn't how it works in Japanese. Usually, like 99% of the time, the pitch gets maintained. Another issue with advanced learners is sometimes patterns are underfit, to use statistics terminology. But basically, the patterns people learn are too simple. So they hear one example and then they extrapolate from that and apply that to everything else, but sometimes that's not right. So a simple example of this would be if someone hears akai kamera, which is like red camera. In English, it's red camera, right? It's not red camera, it's red camera, right? So the word kind of like compounds in some sense in terms of the stress action. So when you hear akai kamera, you might think that the same thing is happening there. Akai kamera. But it's just a coincidence. So it just happens to be that akai is flat and kamera drops like that. So if you had another combination of words like aoi kuruma, that would be like blue car. There is no, like, it's not aoi kuruma. That would be like blue car in English, right? But it's aoi kuruma in Japanese. So the pitches of the two words are just maintained next to each other. So advanced learners can sometimes, take one pattern they heard somewhere in one place, akai kamera, and apply it to everything else, because especially if their native language has a similar pattern in it, then it's really easy to just sort of think that's how it works in Japanese, and it's not. Another advanced learner issue is that a lot of the time people hear the pitch in slightly the wrong place. For example, there's a word in Japanese, kojo, which is like factory. And sometimes you hear learners say something like kojo, where the accent is a little earlier than where it should have been. So they hear that it was accented, and they try to put an accent, but either they didn't hear it correctly the first time, or they did hear it correctly, but then they misremembered it, and it just got stuck as the wrong pattern in their head. There's a lot of reasons for it, but that's another place where advanced learners can have issues, where it's basically the granularity that they're understanding the accent at is not small enough. It's not happening at the right unit of sound in the language. And to elaborate on that for a moment, a lot of people coming from syllable-based languages will sort of imagine Japanese words as syllables and try to put an accent on one of the syllables, but syllable is too large of a unit in Japanese. It's imora that is the proper unit in Japanese, which is smaller, and that's where pitch accent happens at. So yeah, there's a lot of things that can go on. The most important thing to do first is work on your perception. To start, I think it's good to use a tool for this, and let me demonstrate one right here. So this is a website called kotu.io. It's free. You do need to register your account, but it just asks for your email address, and that's it. So it doesn't ask for anything else. And it has a bunch of stuff on it. What we're going to be using here today is this test section. It has some tests on pitch accent. In particular, the perception test is what we're going to be doing. I'm not going to go in detail on this here. I just want to show that it exists and it's a useful tool. In general, you're going to want to start from these green ones, which basically means easy here. So I'm going to briefly show the minimal pairs test. I highly recommend reading this mini guide here in detail because it explains the symbols, and you're going to be lost if you don't understand the symbols. Basically, takai, low, high, and then the slash means drop. So then low, takai, right? Machigai. So that's the basic notation. There's some other important notes here, so please look at that. And when you look at, once you start the test, it'll give you a card like this, and it'll play the audio. And you need to choose which one it is. If you get it right, then it becomes that. If you get it wrong, then you'll be paused here and you can replay
郊外
right?
郊外
So you can replay them and like learn what the difference is. And basically, some of these you'll end up finding easy. Other ones will be hard, and there's reason for that. Usually, it has to do with some interference from your native language. As you keep on doing this, you'll eventually improve your hearing to be able to understand when something is a pitch accent, right? So it's not that you're improving how well you hear like musical pitch. Usually most people can do that. It's how you're interpreting the changes in musical pitch as whether it is a pitch accent or just intonation or something else. So that's how this is useful. I will do a separate video on this specifically about common pitfalls people fall into and why some people can get stuck on this test and like not make progress. But I recommend just playing with it until I release that video. I highly recommend unchecking Nakadaka first and just working on Heiban versus Atamadaka and learning those. And then once you get really good at that, then move on to adding in Nakadaka. As for goals with this, honestly, you should be getting 100% on this, or like 99%. Anything lower, even like 90%, is not a great sign, because this is like the most controlled environment possible, right? It's like words read by an announcer in isolation. So like if you're not hearing the pitch here, you're going to have a really hard issue hearing it in actual content where there's a bunch of other factors going on. So ideally, you should figure out how to get yourself to a really high score here. That said, as is the case with most things, you should never strictly order everything. So if you have any specific tactic and you're like struggling with it, always do things in parallel. So I'm going to be mentioning other tactics here. If you're like struggling with this one, don't do the other tactics until you finish this. It's more like, yeah, just do them in parallel. One will help with the other, etc. All right, so that's kotu. And then the next important thing for improving your perception is going to be getting corrected. So I'm also going to be talking about getting corrected later for a different part of this. But getting corrected also just helps with your perception. So to get corrections is to read something out loud to a native speaker or advanced learner who can correct you. And when you read stuff aloud, people are comfortable correcting you. Because if you're in an actual conversation, then correcting someone means stopping the conversation. That can get awkward. But when you're reading, people will generally feel comfortable correcting you, especially if you're very clear that you want the corrections. So asking for corrections either by using a service like Italki, where you'll just pay someone and get them to correct you, or asking a friend or something, whatever works. You can also post stuff on Discord channels that specialize in Japanese pronunciation or pitch accent. And when you start doing this, you will start getting corrections, and some corrections you may not even immediately understand at first. Like you don't understand what you said differently, right? And then you'll start paying attention to the thing you got corrected on and like unlock a new level of perception when you're simply just trying to understand the correction. And if you keep on doing this for, minutes or hours or multiple days or weeks or however much time you want to put into it, then you will just slowly be not only improving your actual pitch of specific words that you're getting corrected on, but also your overall perception, where you'll be able to catch things which you previously were only subconsciously processing and more explicitly begin to process them. This is actually one of the most important types of feedback loops in language learning, where you have some experience in actually using the language. In this case, it's in a controlled environment getting corrected, but it's still a usage of the language. And you have this experience, and it mentally really registers with you, either emotionally or whatever, right? You get a correction, and you're like, oh, shoot, I want to do better. Or another sort of example would be like you're actually talking to someone and you make a mistake, they couldn't understand you. And like it gets a certain like emotional charge on it. It might not be traumatizing, but there's a certain valence to it. And in that case, like it really teaches your mind that it matters. And once that happens, you will really start paying attention to it in your input. And that feedback loop where you do stuff, realize something that you hadn't noticed before because it causes an issue for you. And then when you're watching other people or watching videos or watching anime or whatever, then you'll really focus in on that. And your selective focus will will start processing it. All right, that's about perception. Next big thing is actually being able to remember pitches. Unfortunately, just because you can hear them doesn't necessarily mean you'll remember them, and certainly not that you'll reproduce them all correctly. I find it's especially hard to remember the pitch if you're remembering it as a separate piece of information. So if you know a word and then also know its pitch separately as a number or maybe the specific mora that you think the accent is on, it can be hard to remember that because that's an extra piece of information. And it tends to be better to remember as part of the word, as the shape of the word. And this can be hard for people coming from a stress accent language because the machinery in your head for that is adopted for stress. And you're going to need to change that same machinery and use it for pitch. This is easier to understand if I give an example for it. So many people might know the famous director Hayao Miyazaki in English. This is Miyazaki Hayao in Japanese. And Miyazaki. That's how you say his last name in Japanese. And I was giving it a little bit of English stress there. So this is how you can adopt your stress machinery for Japanese. The proper Japanese way to say it is Miyazaki. And there's very little emphasis on the accent in the word. But if you pretend to say it like it's English, Miyazaki, and you really put stress on the ya, then there is no way an English person would not remember the way to say the name as that. Miyazaki. Certainly there's more natural stress patterns in English like Miyazaki or something like that, but Miyazaki. Anyone could be able to hear that and reproduce it and remember it as that, right? Because with English stress, you get so many different variables. You get the pitch rises, but you also get a longer vowel. You also get the louder sound. So this is very easy for English speakers. But if you start using the exact same machinery to remember words in Japanese, this can actually be an issue because then you'll start saying the accent in Japanese louder. You might make the vowel longer. You might say certain vowels in the unaccented part of the word incorrectly because in English you tend to schwa vowels in the unaccented part of the word, and you don't do that in Japanese. So if you just blindly start using this machinery, it will cause all sorts of issues with your Japanese, but you can slowly adapt it, right? So if you start by saying Miyazaki, but then you take away the stress part of it and only keep the pitch, Miyazaki, then that ends up slowly adapting the stress machinery into Japanese, and you can remember the word as that shape, and you just remember to not mess up the other parts that you might mess up. So this is sort of a more dangerous way to do things, but it in the long run sort of is required to do it like this because it ends up being very, very difficult. For example, this example is a name, right? So each name has an accent in Japanese, and it's really hard to just remember that as a separate piece of information. You just need to remember it as part of the name, and that basically means you need to use that part of your brain, which if you come from English or another stress accent language is used for stress accent, but you sort of need to repurpose it for pitch accent. So slowly working on doing that is going to be important, and you're going to make mistakes along the way. You're going to notice, if you record yourself, it's very important to record yourself, that suddenly you're just putting stress on things that shouldn't be there. And you're going to need to monitor and stop doing that, but figure out how to use that machinery to remember the pitches of words. Another thing that can help with your memory is, again, getting corrections. In this case, it's not so much for improving your perception, but it's for making your brain realize that this actually matters. Because if there's especially native speaker or someone really high level in the language correcting you, it's really experience to realize that they're noticing every single thing wrong and are able to point out every single thing wrong and say how you should do it instead. That really teaches your brain that facet of the language matters, and you don't want to make mistakes, right? Anyone who likes improving at language, it's frustrating to make mistakes, so you will start paying more attention and making sure you actually remember the right accents for words. Okay, finally, I would like to talk about the value of learning pitch accent using rules. So rules, like almost grammatical like rules for this type of word has this type of pitch. A verb pitch changes this way when you conjugate it, that sort of thing. This is what a lot of the material is centered around. And honestly, my recommendation is that you do not do this, because it's probably better to go based off of your intuition for as long as possible and work on refining your perception and intuition and production, and then try to build a strong foundation in terms of actually immersing and properly noticing and being able to reproduce the pitches. And then maybe as a supplement, go through and like learn some rules if you find that sort of thing interesting. But if you go too hard on the rules early on, I think it just gets overwhelming and possibly confusing. The exception to this advice is if you are the sort of person that loves rules and mathematical breakdowns, maybe if you have a background in computer science or whatever, or linguistics, and you like really like to do the linguistics sort of approach to things. In that case, this actually applies to me. I love like breaking down the rules and like learning about it just as its own exercise. So like I could go do that and have a good time doing it. So therefore it's not a waste of time. But if you're the sort of person who like doesn't like that sort of thing, then it's basically just going to demotivate you and confuse you. And I think there are other ways to go about this other than going hardcore in on learning things by rules. And there's a lot of people out there who learn the rules and in a very controlled environment where they can prepare and like figure out the pitch for a passage, they can read it well. But then in actual conversation, they forget the pitches for words left and right because it's not really, it hasn't become a part of their conception of the sounds of the language. So I think it's much more important to focus on improving your perception and really integrating pitch as part of the basic components of the pronunciation of a word. So in summary, I think it's good to first use tools like kotu to improve your basic perception on your own, because that's something you can do on your own. And then pretty much immediately, so like if you're a beginner, but you can read like hiragana, then just find a text with hiragana, furigana on the kanji, and just make it as simple as possible so you know the words, because there's no point in doing this practice on a text where you don't know the words. And then just like read it out loud to someone, have them start correcting you. It's good to do this live, not so good with recordings because you'll become a perfectionist with recording. It's not good. So just do some basic live sessions. It works even if you're a beginner, and just go through, and it's good to do a certain amount of volume. If you're just starting out, you probably want to spend some time repeating sentences until you get it correct with your corrector. But at some point, you're going to get good at that part of just reproducing something you heard. So once you get over that hump, then it's just going to be a matter of doing volume. So you want to, go through a couple pages, or if you're advanced, you want to go through like many pages of just like going through each sentence for like an hour or something, just getting corrections until like you really get a good sense for pitch in the language. And a lot of people might be anxious about doing this, but honestly, it's not that hard for a native speaker to do this sort of correction. It can be fun for them if they're the sort of person that likes being helpful. And like, just imagine doing it in your native language. Like someone reads out a sentence for you and they say train station instead of train station, and you can just correct them. They say record instead of record, and you can correct them based on the context, right? So that sort of thing isn't really hard for anyone, and you can even ask your friends if it's for a short thing, or find a tutor or something if you want to do it for hours or something. Once you really start doing that, your perception will become good, your ability to remember and reproduce will become good, and then it's just the matter of immersing. So then you just need to immerse for like years. And this is why it matters that you should do all this legwork up front. Because if you don't, then you're going to learn Japanese without the pitch of the words. And like I mentioned at the outset, this isn't a huge issue. Like, you're often still comprehensible in many cases, but it can be really, really hard to then go back and fix everything, because you sort of almost, in some sense, wasted time you could have been also acquiring the pitch of words in your immersion. So this is the basic idea: improve your perception and then really immerse a lot, and then make sure you're actually remembering and and being able to reproduce the pitches by occasionally doing more check-ins and getting more corrections on a sort of loose schedule. And again, this is where goals come in. So if you're just trying to get okay pronunciation, then doing some subset of what I said or only doing a single correction session or two might be fine for you. If you're like aiming for native level pronunciation and you want to be a perfectionist, then you're going to want to spend more time on this, do more sessions with more corrections, maybe spend more time looking at rules or spend more time looking up pitches in dictionaries and things like that. There's a whole spectrum of how much time you want to spend on it. And especially if you are a more advanced learner already and you're trying to go back and fix your bad habits for everything, unfortunately, that means you're going to need to put in a lot more time because not only are you trying to improve your perception, you're actually trying to correct things that you've built bad habits around on. So that will take an extra chunk of effort and time. But that's the basic strategy. Improve your perception, improve your ability to reproduce and recall pitch accent by means of initially doing simple minimal pair tests and then further on by getting corrections on your read out loud material. All right, that's all I'm going to do today. Look forward to some other videos. I'm currently thinking of doing one video on issues, roadblocks that people hit with doing the minimal pair test. And then I'm also considering doing a series of videos on more advanced topics in pitch accent that basically are not covered anywhere else as far as I'm aware, except maybe in some like linguistics papers that are written in Japanese. This is going to be things like sentence level intonation, for example, for relative clauses, as well as things like ososagari and other phenomena that basically aren't really covered anywhere and can be confusing to people who are paying really close attention. So that's what I sort of have planned. I don't really plan to become a huge YouTuber or regularly publish a lot of stuff. But basically, I spend a lot of time explaining things on Discord, and I figured it'd be good to just put it somewhere where I can regularly link people to it. So that's the video. Thanks for watching. Leave any comments or feedback you might have, and see you next time.